I tend to agree with Adam Goods that the best way of dealing with the prevalence of racism in Australian society is through conversation and education. I'll talk about my ideas about education a little later on, but I am a great fan of Adam Goods. In fact, he gave me his jumper, and it appears he's a great fan of mine because he's also spelled my name right on the jumper. Quite an unusual experience for me. Just to put my credentials on the table, I started off my career as a linguist, specialising in Indigenous languages. And during one of my vacation breaks at uni, I went off to a community in the Pilbara region of West Australia to embed myself with the family there and to learn to read and write their own language. I was fortunate to be taught by some of the best in the community. And once I did graduate with my degree, I went back to that community to continue transcribing the language and to produce an alphabetic grammar and help the people in the community develop some readers in their own language so that they in turn could teach their own kids to read and write in their own language. Once I finished there, I moved back to Melbourne, became a tutor in Aboriginal Studies at Monash Uni, but then went back to Central Australia as a teacher linguist and later principal in Aboriginal communities throughout Central Australia. Again, back at Melbourne, I spent some time in various protest communities, protest meetings with the likes of Gary Foley and Marcia Langton and Eve Fiesel and Michael Mansell, sitting around the table with them, planning various land rights marches and various protests and guerrilla activities. So I feel as though I've got a pretty good insight on the values of these people, what they believe in and what honestly affects them. I don't feel as though I'm a bleeding heart in any way, shape or form in these sort of environments, and I understand the reality of what these people are confronted with, plus the reality of what they bring to their own society. But throughout all of that, I really do identify that there's a problem that we're all just tiptoeing around. And the problem to me is how Aboriginal affairs or how Aboriginal education and culture is taught in our schools. What is its key component in the curriculum? And I find that the curriculum in most schools is based on some of the touristy sort of aspects of Aboriginal culture. Their singing, their art, their dance, and the fact that they were living here, they existed before Captain Cook first arrived. All those sort of superficial, touristy and a little bit quaint aspects of the culture. It's not terribly authentic, it's not terribly real. It doesn't talk about values, it doesn't talk about beliefs and underlying feelings of how the people feel about the way they go about their own life. And you know what, I reckon the best way to address that is for all kids in our schools to learn an Indigenous Australian language. There are plenty of resources, there are plenty of opportunities, there is plenty of material online which schools can tap into as part of their Aboriginal education curriculum and start to learn an Australian Indigenous language. You might wonder what's the point of that. It's not as though many of these people are going to go and visit these communities. It's not as though many people are going to enter into a commercial arrangement in these communities and therefore need to know how to speak the language. But there are so many benefits in learning a second language, and I think that's acknowledged in any education environment. But the benefits of learning an Indigenous second language are profound. Firstly, you'll never be exposed to a language as different as what an Australian Indigenous language is. It's unique in the way it produces sounds, in the way it produces its words, in the syntactic structure of the sentences, the grammar in other words, and it's quite unique in a lot of the semantic scope of the meanings of words. So this uniqueness can only serve to broaden the learner's mind and broaden their view of the world and gain them a better perspective, a wider perspective of what goes on in these different places. But learning a second language gives you an authentic insight into that culture. You immerse yourself in the language, which means you immerse yourself in the culture. Because language and culture are so fundamentally intertwined that you really can't learn one without observing the other. Learning an Indigenous language, for instance, you'll start to talk about the moieties, the skin groups, how families are formed, the interrelationships, the marriage rules, the engagement rules, the communication rules. It's inevitable you hear stories and you'll analyse stories about how the country came to be and how certain features, geographic features in the countryside came to exist. All these sorts of things are an important part of learning in any Indigenous language. So without this authentic component to any school curriculum, I find it creates a vacuum. I find it creates a vacuum where people don't have a good grasp of what an Australian Indigenous community's values are, their cultures, their beliefs, their feelings. And when there's a vacuum, other people tip into it. So where there's a vacuum, you get the information tipped in from your parents, from your friends, from a church if you belong to a church, and from all these other non-authoritative sources that will provide the information about what an Aboriginal culture is and what an Aboriginal person thinks and does. So that's not good, that's not ideal, because that information that's tipped in is often quite wrong, quite misleading and not real. So this is why I believe it's important to be teaching an Indigenous Aboriginal language in a school, because your insights become authentic.